Hi, this is Scott from Chino Basin Water Conservation District here at the Waterwise Community Center Demonstration Garden, and today we're going to look at how to prune white sage. White sage, Salvia apiana, is an incredible plant for almost any garden here in Southern California. I use it in the vast majority of the landscapes that I am involved with. So many benefits. It's a beautiful plant, it smells amazing, and it's an incredible habitat plant. A variety of native pollinators use the flowers, and then if you let those flowers fade and fully develop seeds in the garden like we do here, a variety of songbirds will come for months and months to eat all of the little seeds out of the dried flower stems. And then after those seeds drop, a whole host of other birds might come through to forage for those seeds off the ground. However, at the very end of the season, ideally in fall or early winter, in order to set that plant up for long-term aesthetic form in the garden, as well as to promote a maximum bloom in the subsequent season, we like to do some pruning as well. We'll have two main objectives when we prune white sage. The first one is to remove the old flower stalks, and that's similar to a concept you might have heard called deadheading, which is essentially removing the old flowering material back to the main part of the plant. And wherever appropriate with white sage, I like to do what I call deadheading plus, where in order to encourage a bushy form over time, I might also cut a little bit farther down into the plant material to maintain a denser form and a bushier appearance. It will induce a little bit more branching and keep the plant a little bit more compact. And so let's get started. So let's take a look at this first dried out flowering stalk that we want to prune. What I normally do is I'll identify the stalk I want to prune, and then I'll sort of visually scan my way down along it, down, 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 until I determine my cut point. And this is something that you might see, especially on a white sage that's more than a year or two old, where sometimes there's just some dieback, where there's not a real solid or distinct transition between what's the part of the stem that would be kind of the foliage part of the plant and what is the actual flowering part of the plant. It's much more fluid on white sage. And so generally what I'll do is anything that looks kind of dead, I'll go down below. And white sage has a pretty good ability to resprout, especially if there's any sort of little bit of leafy material below your cut. So on this one, I'm going to go below all of this dead looking material, even though there's a little bit of leafy material, and I'm going to cut above this location. And this is called a node. A node is an area where new growth emerges, and we'll look at some other nodes in just a moment, but generally what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to cut about a 1/4 inch above a node. I will support the flowering stalk with my other hand, make a cut as cleanly as possible, and then remove it. And let's look at a couple more things right here. You can see, and this sometimes does happen on white sage, where there's a little bit of a crush area on the back. It's not a perfect cut, and that's because the branches are relatively weak and the stem is pretty much hollow. And so it's a little bit harder to get a clean cut compared to like cutting into a small branch on a hard woody species. Keeping your pruner sharp as possible definitely helps with that. But if it's like that, don't worry about it. White sage is pretty good at healing itself up. And you can see here, there's some other funkiness. I'll just trim that off, and maybe I'll trim this back a little bit. And this will then allow this plant to be ready to do some, get a better trim here, do some nice growth coming out of this area. We have a little bit of dead on the back. We have this other stalk coming through in here. I'll just cut this back. This one looks to be kind of completely dried out. And we'll just do a little bit more cleanup work and get that ready for some nice subsequent growth. So you may have heard when pruning, you want to cut above a node. Many people are confused though as to what exactly is a node. I'll explain it is a node is generally an area along a stem where there is a slight swelling. You might see some new growth coming out, but depending on the plant, depending on the part of the year, it might just be a small swollen area. And in general, you want to cut above a node just about 1/4 of an inch, because a node is where there is potential for new growth to emerge. On the vast majority of plants, new growth is not just going to emerge anywhere. New growth will only emerge out of a node area. On some plants, it's very easy to see the swelling. On some plants, you might not see the node visually at all. But white sage is one where it's quite easy to see the nodes. And when you cut above a node, there are going to be chemical changes in the plant which stimulate the plant to release a burst of growth through that. The reason why we say cut about 1/4 of an inch above a node, so let's just say if this is the node that I was going to cut, we'd want to be just above that, is because if you cut right at the node, there's a pretty high chance that you might actually cut into the tissue, or if your cut is not perfectly straight, you might sort of undermine the main branch's structural support of the new growth that will emerge. And so you don't want to cut too close or right on top of the node. However, if you go farther away from the node, essentially the plant is also going to need, after a pruning cut, to initiate a process to heal itself. And it's not really going to be able to do that very far away from a node. So what happens is that you might just get dieback to that node, and if there's, say, an inch of dieback because you cut that too far, that is just going to sort of dry out. It's not going to heal over very quickly, and it's going to be prone to rotting. And so cutting just about 1/4 of an inch or so above the node ends up being the sort of happy medium place to get the best effect on the plant in terms of supporting it for future growth out of the node, as well as healing quickly from what essentially is a surgical cut with your pruners. However, there's one additional thing to keep in mind when we're pruning plants that, after they're blooming, naturally get a bit of dieback, like our white sage, which is the fact that we have this series of old nodes here which have now died back. They are not going to be ones through which new growth is going to emerge. And so just to sort of show you that, there's a node right here, and when we cut this, we're going to see it's very dry. And in fact, this stem has already hollowed out. It's a useful thing to have in the garden, and we'll talk about that later. But what we are trying to do when we're pruning our white sage, I'm going to trim up something that broke. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that we are cutting back into living tissue. So how do you know? Well, there are a few ways to do it. Here, certainly we can tell because we see some new leaves emerging. And the best way to really know is to see either some tiny new leaves emerging, or to see a substantial swelling in the node, even though the leaves, if you're pruning earlier in the fall, might not have broken through yet, and you know new growth is going to come out of there. So an easy thing to do is we can cut just sort of right above this area where the vegetative growth is emerging. And you can see we still have our kind of little bit of a crushed stem, like does sometimes happen, but this is going to grow out and do quite well. Now, while we are taking care of this, we are also going to prune these other little dead areas. You can see back to these nodes. White sage is a plant that grows a lot every year, but it also gets some significant dieback every year. We might come back to this later and cut even farther down in order to stimulate an even bushier form of the plant. But for now, what we're going to be doing is just a first pass through, kind of trimming everything back to get rid of our dead, and going at least down to the vegetative growth, if not a little bit lower. As you do this work, the most important thing to keep in mind, by far more important than anything else, is to always be aware of where your other hand is. You never want to remove the tip of your finger because you are going through your pruning work a little too efficiently. The other thing I always try to do, as you can see my left hand, which is my offhand working, is to have that hand constantly ready to gather the trimmed plant material, which just makes everything more efficient. And so you can see in just a few minutes, we've done a pretty thorough job beginning to clean out this area here, and we're going to continue that throughout the rest of the plant. I'm going to save this one because we're going to take a more in-depth look at it later. So you can see on this example that I just trimmed out that I actually did remove a few leaves as well, and this is part of that deadheading plus concept that I talked about. A lot of the plant material I removed so far just based on the growth of this particular sage. I was just sort of doing that deadheading cut. But here was an example where inside the plant, right below this cut, there was fresher, newer growth. And while these leaves are still alive, you can see that these are older leaves from the last season that are still kind of in decline. And so in this case, just deadheading, only removing dead material, might have cut here. But this is older, less vigorous plant material than the plant material lower down was. So I just trimmed the whole thing. It's going to have a very nice stimulating effect on the plant and release the plant to be able to really push its energy along the stem into fueling that new growth. So now we're going to bring the camera in, and I want to bring your attention to some specific examples of decisions that you might make when you're pruning your white sage. So on this stem, you can see if we're doing our process where we're visually traveling down, we get to this really nice little bit of growth right here. But if we do make this cut, what we are left with is this nice bit of growth, but then we still have this older, kind of drier looking, there's some dieback on it, bit of stem, and this will grow just fine. In terms of plant health, the plant's probably not going to care, but just in terms of our aesthetic in the garden and wanting to continually release a lot of new, kind of more tender growth in the plant season after season, keep this plant as long-lived and looking as good as possible, I'm actually going to cut farther down. So this is that deadheading plus concept where we're going to go at least to here. But there's so much nice growth right in here that I'm probably going to even go a little bit further, clean this up, and really let this stalk put its effort into this very vigorous bushy growth. So if we look at this stalk, which is at the edge of the white sage plant, very similar to the last example. However, even if I do my pruning cut here and remove it for all that beautiful growth, if we take a step back and if we look at the growth of the plant overall, this is really an older woody stem that's out at the very edge of the plant. And so sometimes what I will do is, just in terms of visual balance, I might choose to remove this. Or in this case, with that deadheading plus concept, I just changed my mind as we were going about what I was going to do. I'm going to trim it just farther back above some lower new growth, which is really visually going to help bring the plant into a nicer, more compact form than if I chose to prune higher up. So now that we've removed all of the taller flowering stalks, our next step is going to be just to remove anything that's left, various dried out stalks from maybe flowering stems that might have broken and we trimmed throughout the season, and all of this smaller material. Sometimes you might see some branches that have experienced some died back farther down. This is a good opportunity to remove any of those as you're going through the process. And if a few of these smaller ones get left, no big deal. But since we're here, we'll remove them today. So now we're most of the way there. We have removed a lot of the old dried material. We've cut a little bit farther down in a few places to kind of release some of that material that's still kind of alive, but maybe there's more vigorous potential a little bit lower down. And as your white sages get older, this one's only a couple of years old, you might find yourself doing a little bit more of that to keep the plant vigorous. And so now we have a nice, much more compact form, but I'm still going to do a little bit more. One of the things that you might notice if you have white sage and you're irrigating it even just a little bit, even just that every 3 to 4 weeks to kind of keep it happy and a little bit less dormant in the summer, is that sometimes they grow a lot, and they'll grow very long branches very quickly, and then under the weight of their own flowers, they might be prone to snapping their own branches. And the more kind of pruning we do to keep it compact and bushy, the more we can help the plant protect itself against that. And so we have all of this beautiful growth. Now, right now we are in January. The ideal pruning time for white sage might be earlier in the fall. We might be talking more around November. And so a lot more of this new growth has sort of already grown seasonally, has been released from the plant. These might be more in the nodes or just starting to grow phase if we pruned in November. However, life is life. We prune when we have time to prune. And so we're working around all of this, and this is absolutely fine. But one of the things that we will do, since it's still not so late in the season that there's flower buds starting to form, if it was further on in the season, we'd maybe just skip pruning for the year or wait or just remove the dried material. But what we are going to do is just induce a little bit more of that bushiness by doing just some quick little kind of hair trim pruning. And we're not going to hit each one, but we're just going to take a little bit off the top for some of these taller, potentially leggier stems. And what that's going to do is that's going to induce a little bit more branching, where areas where there's just one stem growing are going to potentially turn into 2, 3, or 4. It might give us a few more blooms, but more importantly, it's going to hopefully protect some of those longer stems from having the structural issues that might cause a little bit of splitting. So again, this is optional, but just a last little step that might help us in the long run. This is not something that I would necessarily come back and do for like a second winter season pruning. I absolutely wouldn't do that. But since we're doing our pruning right now and looking at that, I feel like just those extra few cuts have helped bring the plant into a little bit more of a compact form, which might reward us a little bit later in the season. And so that's basically it for pruning our white sage. The most important thing to remember if you're interested in working on your pruning is to just give it a shot. If you're following the basic principles that we're talking about, even if it doesn't turn out perfectly for you, it's going to grow back. You can learn and try again next season. Just don't be afraid to take it on. And so the last thing we want to look at is just how much plant material we removed. So remember what we started with, and here's our sage plant, and we removed a little bit of live material, but so much of this dried out material, which is really going to help it grow and bloom more abundantly in this coming season. So the next question is, what do you do with all this material? Because it's actually very useful stuff for your garden in terms of providing habitat for the beneficial wildlife we would like to see. This doesn't need to all go into the green bin if you have some space. And so what I like to do with as much of this material as possible, and depending on your time, your physical ability, and the size of your yard, you might be able to do more of this, you might do less of it. But there are still sometimes a little bit of seed left, even at the very end of the season, stuff that was stuck in here that the birds were not able to get out. And so what we like to do is called a little bit of chop and drop, which is just taking our pruners and making some mulch out of this right here on the spot. And over time, these will continue to break apart. And importantly, in most gardens in Southern California, if you're gardening for habitat and have the right plants and doing practices like this, eventually, if not pretty quickly, you'll start getting that whole other cast of birds that are more ground foragers. And so they're not going to be very likely at all to hop up into the white sage to pick the seeds out like our goldfinches and our house finches will do as soon as those seeds ripen. but especially in the fall and winter months, your garden will be likely to be visited by white-crowned sparrows, which will forage on the ground, picking and kicking things apart. And year-round, you might have towhees and mourning doves, all of which prefer to forage on the ground. And so the more of that you can do, the better. I really am a fan of over time in a native garden, whether it's trimming by hand or using a small electric chipper shredder to create as much of your own natural mulch on site. The first year, usually we'll just bring in the wood chip mulch, get the site established. But after that, plants grow in, they become self-mulching, and in the spaces in between, you can really create a lot of your own mulch, which is going to really amplify the habitat benefit compared to anything that you could obtain by bringing in wood chips or any imported mulch, as well as keeping your own green waste on site and really benefiting the whole ecosystem overall. So that's what we're going to do with the more flowering parts of the stem, and we might do that with some of the hollow parts of the stem as well. These hollow stems are also very valuable for nesting spaces for many species of native insect. Longer pieces can also be very valuable for different species of native cavity dwelling bees. And that can be as simple as making sure you leave some of this around your garden and they might use it. But if you really want to provide the ideal conditions and you want to also do it in an interesting way where you can come back and observe whether or not those bees are actually using your garden, you can take a number of cuttings, about 6 inches in length, and use those to create habitat nesting features for native cavity dwelling bees. So if you're interested in learning all about how to do that, I highly encourage you to take a quick look at our DIY native pollinator habitat projects playlist on our YouTube channel. So I'm here right now with another example of a white sage in the same landscape. I'm maybe 8 feet away from the plant that we just pruned, and this is a few weeks of growth after pruning. This sage was pruned to create a YouTube short on our channel by our team, just showing in about a minute all of the basic principles that we talked about. So feel free to check that out if you want to review. And really, this is showing kind of task accomplished. The goal with pruning, in most cases in a naturalistic garden, is that we are trying to keep plants healthy, as vigorous as possible, keep them blooming nicely year after year. But after a little bit of regrowth, it almost looks to the casual observer like no pruning happened at all. The plant is just nicely formed and compact. And so if you look farther in, you can see pruning cuts, but from those cuts, so much new growth was stimulated that has kind of grown out and taken over that we just have a nice, very compact, bushy white sage. Depending on your particular structure of your plant, each plant over time has its own personality. Yours may or may not be this low and compact after pruning. It also depends on how often you prune, if you do it every year, which we recommend, if you do it every couple of years. But this essentially is pretty much what we're going for, and it's going to set up so many flowers that will be beautiful and that the pollinators are going to love this coming season. So if you found this video helpful, please remember to give it a like. It really helps other people find our content online. And be sure to subscribe to our channel, because we're going to continue to create a whole series of videos really showing our take on every aspect of how we design, build, and maintain beautiful water-wise and California native gardens for our region.